Hey, my name is Eli Calhoun. I'm 36 years old, and I run an old timber grist mill at the bottom of a holler called Sparrow's Rest, deep in the Blue Ridge of western North Carolina, where the mountains fold over on themselves green and blue forever, and the creek never stops telling its one long story. It isn't much by anyone's measure. A leaning chestnut log mill my great-grandfather raised over the rushing water, a wheel that still turns the burr stones if I baby it, a workshop where I make chairs and cradles and coffins out of the same patient wood, a kitchen garden, and a plain cabin with a porch where I light a lantern every night out of stubbornness more than need. The mountain folk used to bring their corn to be ground, and some still do, but mostly I make my living with my hands at the bench, sanding and joining wood until it's smooth enough to trust. People down in the town of Hawks Branch don't call me Eli much anymore. They call me the miller who got crushed, or the cripple up Sparrow's Rest, and both are true enough. There's a heavy oak beam that fell on me in a winter storm 6 years ago when the old loft gave way, and it took my left leg below the knee and left it a ruin of pins and scars that aches before every rain. I walk with a hickory cane I carved myself, and I drag that leg a little, and folks notice. Children point. Grown men shake my hand and then look down at the leg like it's a question nobody wants to ask out loud. So a long while back I stopped going into Hawks Branch more than I had to, and I stopped reaching out to people unless the work made me. Before the beam fell, I used to walk the high ridges and fiddle at the dances and grin like I had a right to. Then the loft came down and took the leg, and the fever after took most of a year, and the bank that held my father's note on the mill kept right on counting while I learned to stand again. That's the stone I carried into the evening she came up my road. The Hawks Branch Bank had sent a letter 6 weeks back with a date typed cold across it. The balloon payment my father had borrowed against to keep the mill through a flood year was due in full on the last day of the month, $9,000, and the manager had told me twice already, kindly, the way you tell a child, that the note was the note and there'd be no more time. The last day of the month was 19 days out, and I had $140 in a coffee tin and a stack of unsold chairs. I had done the math every way a man can, and it always came up the same. My father used to stand at this porch rail with his pipe and say, "The mountain doesn't care what a man looks like, only whether he keeps faith with it." The last thing he told me, gone thin and gray in the county hospital, was, "Keep the mill turning, Eli, and if ever somebody comes up that road needing shelter, you give it even when it costs you, for that's the only kind of rich folk like us are ever offered." I'd nodded and meant it the way you mean a thing you don't yet understand. I didn't understand it until the night she came. It was late October, the light going amber and then deep blue down the holler, the maples gone red as coals on the ridges, when I heard a car laboring up the rough track that hardly deserves to be called a road. I was on the porch oiling a chair I'd just finished, and I set it down and waited the way you wait for weather. The car was a clean, dark thing too fine for that track, and it stopped uncertain at my gate like the driver wasn't sure if she'd reached the end of something or the start of it. A young woman got out before the engine had fully died, maybe 27, in a thin, pale dress and a town coat with no warmth in it, holding a leather satchel against her chest like a shield. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her eyes had the look I knew from the inside, the look of someone who has been running long enough that stopping feels more dangerous than going. She came up the path without being asked, and her eyes went to my cane and then to the dragging leg. And then, deliberately, they did not flinch away. And that small thing, that refusal to look away, was the first thing that ever tightened my chest over a stranger. "Are you the man who owns this mill?" she asked, and her voice was steady but worn thin, the way a rope is steady right before it isn't. I told her I was. She looked back down the dark holler the way she'd come, like the night itself might catch her up. Then she lifted her chin and said the words I will hear at the back of my skull the rest of my days. I need a husband by morning, she said. A real one, lawful, on paper. I have until my birthday, and my birthday is tomorrow. I didn't laugh, and I want that on the record, because a lot of men would have. There was nothing funny in her face. There was only fear held down hard under a layer of will, and under that, somewhere I could barely see, the kind of hope a person hates herself for still owning. I set the oil rag on the rail, and I looked at this stranger standing at the end of my nowhere road, and the only thing I asked her was the only thing that mattered. "What are you running from?" I said. Something went out of her then, some long-held breath, like she'd braced for a different question. For who are you? Or what do you want for it? Or are you mad? And instead I'd asked the one that let her be a person and not a problem. "My family," she said. "There's a condition in my grandmother's will. If I'm married by my 28th birthday to a man of my own choosing, her share of the home place and the timber rights pass to me, free and clear. If I'm not, it all falls to my uncle's trust, and he has already chosen a husband for me, a man who sees me as a line in a ledger." "I won't be sold," she said. I packed a bag, and I drove east into the mountains until the road ran out. And the road ran out at your gate. Maybe a wiser man asks for the whole of it before he moves. But my father's voice was in my ear, and the cold was coming down off the ridge, and I have never in my life been able to turn away from someone braced to be turned away. "Come up to the fire," I said. "You can tell me the rest on the way down to the courthouse. For the magistrate in Hawks Branch owes my father a kindness and asks few questions." Her name was Nora Ashby, and over a tin cup of coffee she could barely hold without it shaking, she told me enough. Her people were Old Mountain money, the Ashbys, who'd owned the timber on 3 ridges before the war and turned it into mills and then into banks and then into the kind of money that buys judges a round of golf. Her grandmother had been the one soft heart in a hard line, and before she died, she'd watched her son marry his daughters off like he was trading mules, and she'd written that will to give one of them a choice. Nora's birthday was tomorrow, and her uncle, a man named Garrett Ashby, who ran the family holdings now and meant to go right on running them, had already promised her to a business partner of his, a smooth, pale man with cold hands who'd looked at her once across a dinner table the way you look at a deed. "I'm not asking you to love me," Nora said, and her voice went flat with shame. "I'm not asking you to pretend. I have a little money, I can pay you for the trouble, and come spring when the will is settled you'll be quit of me." I looked at the coffee tin on the shelf with my $140 and the bank letter folded under it, and for one ugly second the arithmetic of my own ruin whispered at me. Then I looked at her face, at the chin she kept up, and the tears she would not spend in front of a stranger, and I have worn that exact look, and I knew it from the inside. "I don't want your money," I said. "Keep it. You'll have need of it." We were married that night by the magistrate in Hawks Branch, an old man named Pruitt, who'd ground his corn at my mill 30 years and asked no question a man couldn't answer, with a night clerk and a deputy standing witness in a hallway that smelled of floor wax and wood smoke. When Pruitt said the words and Nora whispered "I do," she was looking at the floor. When he turned to me, I looked at her, and I said it clear. "I do, because if I was going to do a thing, I was going to do it like I meant it, and some part of me even then did." We drove home up the dark holler under a sky thick with stars, the kind you only get where there's no town to drown them, and neither of us said much. At the cabin I made up the small back room that had been my mother's, with clean quilts and a good lamp, and I showed her the bolt on the door. "It works," I told her. "You can throw it. I sleep out by the stove, and I'll not ever try it. You have my word, and up this holler a man's word is about all he owns, so I don't spend it cheap." She stood in the doorway holding her satchel and looked at me a long moment, this scarred stranger she'd married 3 hours back. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, and there was suspicion in it, but under the suspicion was exhaustion, and under that, again, the thing she hated herself for hoping. "Because my father told me to help whoever came up the road," I said, "and because you didn't look away from my leg." She had no answer for that. She went in, and after a while I heard the bolt slide, and I stood in the dark a moment listening to a sound that meant a frightened stranger felt safe enough to sleep under my roof, and I went to my pallet by the stove feeling, for the first time in 6 years, like the cabin was not entirely empty. The first days were careful as crossing creek stones in the dark. She kept to herself and learned the rhythms of the place from a distance. The way I rose before light to grease the wheel and feed the burr stones their corn. The way I talked low to the wood at the bench like it could hear me. The way I favored the leg on the wet mornings and pretended I didn't. On the 3rd day I came in from the mill, and the cabin smelled of something other than scorched coffee for the first time in years. She'd found the flour and the lard and made biscuits, and she set a plate in front of me without a word and watched, almost afraid, to see whether I'd take it as charity or as insult. I took it as the kindest thing anyone had done for me in longer than I could count, and I told her so with my mouth full, and she laughed, a startled, rusty sound like a hinge that hadn't turned in years, and something between us loosened a notch. After that, we found a rhythm. She had a head for figures, it turned out, sharper than mine, and she took my account book that had gone to chaos and made it sing, and she found that I'd been selling my chairs for half what the work was worth. "We're going to fix that," she said. And she said we like it was the most ordinary word in the world, and I had to look out the window a while. She learned the mill fast. She'd hold the sack while I poured, and she'd talk to the old wheel like it was a balky animal, and somehow the bearing that had groaned for a year ran quieter for her. She wasn't soft, for all her town clothes. She split kindling and hauled water, and never once complained of the cold coming down the holler. I fixed the cabinet hinge in the kitchen that had hung crooked since my mother's time, and she watched me do it leaning on the cane and said, "You fix everything, but you won't fix that broken step that near killed me twice." So I fixed the step. She put a jar of late asters from along the creek on the windowsill, and the morning light came through it onto the table, and I sat there longer than I needed to, because it was the kind of small thing a home has and a house does not. Little by little, the cabin started to feel like one. She found my mother's recipe box in a drawer no one had opened since the funeral and learned to make the apple stack cake my mother used to make for the harvest. And the first time she set it on the table, I had to step out onto the porch a minute before I could come back and eat it. And Nora didn't ask why. She just kept my plate warm. We traded our griefs slow, the way you pay out a rope so it doesn't burn your hands. Her mother had died when she was 10, and the family had handled her grief like a scheduling matter. My mother had passed the winter before the loft fell, and my father a few years after, and I told her about the night the beam came down because she asked about the legs straight out, not sideways the way most folks do. I told her how the loft gave in the storm, and I'd gone up to save the seed corn, and the floor took me, and how I'd lain pinned in the cold dark half a night before a neighbor heard the wheel grinding wrong and came, and how the town had quietly decided after that I was a thing to be sorry for. And when I finished, she didn't say it wasn't your fault the way people do to fill a silence. She came around the table and she put her hand flat against the worst of the scars below my knee, where almost nobody looks, and she held it there. I don't see a ruined man, she said. I see a man who climbed into a falling building for a sack of seed that couldn't thank him, and got broke for it, and still gets up before light to keep faith with this place. That's not broken, Eli. That's the opposite of broken. Nobody had touched that leg on purpose in 6 years. I had to look out at the dark holler a while before I could trust my voice, and when I could, all I said was, "It's late." But I didn't move, and neither did she. I won't pretend I didn't know by then what was happening to me. A man my age, alone as long as I'd been alone, doesn't mistake the feeling when it comes. I just didn't think I had any right to it. She'd come to me running, and I'd given my word, and I wasn't going to be one more man who wanted something from her she'd never offered. So I kept it behind my teeth, and I let the days do what days do, and I told myself that come spring the will would settle, and she'd take her freedom and her grandmother's timber and her own life and drive back down my road, and I'd have the memory of a few good weeks to warm the next long stretch of quiet. That was the plan I made. That was the plan that lasted right up until the morning a black car came up the holler that didn't slow uncertain at the gate the way Nora's had. It came up like it owned the track, and the man who got out of it was Garrett Ashby. I knew him before she said his name. Some men carry their money in their shoulders, and he was one of them. Pressed wool on a mountain morning, a watch worth more than my mill, a smile practiced in a mirror until it didn't need the man behind it. He had a lawyer with him, a soft, sweating fellow with a briefcase, and he stood in my yard and looked at my leaning mill and my stacked chairs like he was pricing it all for kindling. "So you're the husband," Garrett said, and the word came out of him like something scraped off a boot. "I have to hand it to you, Nora. When you decide to be common, you commit." Nora had come out onto the porch behind me, and I felt her go rigid. "You can't undo it, Garrett," she said. "It's done. It's lawful. The will is mine on my birthday, and there's nothing you can do." "Oh, the marriage is real," Garrett said, smiling wider. "I'm sure it is. But here's the thing about your grandmother's will, sweetheart, and I'd have explained it if you'd answered your phone. A marriage entered into for the sole purpose of defrauding the conditions of a will isn't a marriage at all in the eyes of the law. It's a sham. And a sham can be set aside." He nodded at the sweating lawyer, who stepped forward and held out a thick envelope to me like it was a gift. "We've filed in district court at Hawks Branch," the lawyer said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "A petition to declare the marriage void as a fraud upon the will, and a related action. Your wife transferred a parcel of timber rights into a joint deed with you 4 days ago. Mr. Calhoun and the family contends that transfer was made under undue influence and clouds the title, which we're moving to quiet. There's also," he hesitated, and Garrett's smile never moved, "a complaint forwarded to the county that the grist mill is operating unsafe and ought to be condemned. An anonymous concern. The hearing on all of it is set for the 30th. The 30th, the last day of the month. The same day my note came due. I understood then, standing in my own yard with that envelope in my hand, that this man had looked into my life the way you look into a poor man's wallet, found the bank date, and chosen it on purpose, so that on the day I might lose the mill for $9,000. I'd also be in a courtroom fighting to keep my wife from being called a fraud. He wanted me broke and rattled and easy to step over. "Nora and I will be reasonable people," Garrett said, walking back toward his car. "Sign a quiet annulment, hand back the deed, and I'll see the bank gets handled. You keep your sawdust and your cane, Miss Calhoun, and we all forget this unpleasantness. Or you fight the Ashbys in a courtroom with a coffee tin full of money and lose everything, the mill and her both. Think on which kind of man you want to be. He drove off and left the dust hanging, and Nora sat down hard on the fixed porch step and put her face in her hands, and I stood a long while before I could make myself sit down beside her. "I've ruined you," she said into her palms. "He'll take the mill. He'll stand in a courtroom and say I tricked you, that you only married me for the timber. And he has lawyers and a judge he golfs with, and I've brought all of it down on the one person who was decent to me. The safe thing, the smart thing, was to do exactly what Garrett wanted. I knew it. Sign the paper, hand back the deed, let him pay the bank, keep my mill and my quiet, and lose nothing but a woman I had no right to in the first place. I sat there, and I did the math of it one more time. And then I reached over and I lifted her chin the way she'd lifted her own that first evening, so she had to look at me. "Nora," I said, "I've got to tell you a thing, and I need you to hear it before you decide anything, because I don't want it weighing on the wrong side of your scale. I didn't marry you for the timber. I married you because you came up my road needing a husband, and I had it in me to be one. And somewhere in these weeks, mending that hinge and watching you set my account book straight and listening to you talk that old wheel quiet, I stopped pretending to myself. I've gone and fallen in love with my wife." There, it said. "So I'm not signing his paper. Not for the mill, not for the money, not for anything. They sent a hired husband to take you, and I'll not hand you back so they can finish what they started. We're going to that hearing, and we're going to win." She stared at me, and her eyes filled, and for a second I feared I'd said too much and frightened her off. Then she said, in a whisper, "You'd lose the mill for me." "I'd lose more than that," I said. "But I don't believe I'm going to have to." That night I started making calls, and I learned a thing men like Garrett Ashby forget, that a poor man who has lived in a place all his life and never cheated a soul carries a kind of credit that doesn't show on a bank's books. Old Pruitt, the magistrate who'd married us, remembered my father and would swear under oath that our marriage was performed in good faith, no coaching, with Nora's free and clear consent. The night clerk who'd witnessed it said she'd never seen two people stand up plainer or quieter. The county inspector who came up about the anonymous concern over the mill spent an afternoon walking my works and climbing the wheel, and he left shaking his head, and he wrote in his report that the grist mill was sound timber, well kept, and a sight safer than half the operations in the county. And then there was Nora's grandmother. Because Nora, going through the satchel she'd packed in such a hurry, found among her things a bundle of the old woman's letters she'd grabbed without thinking, and in that bundle was the grandmother's own hand, year after year, laying out in plain words exactly why she'd written the will the way she had. "I have watched my son sell his daughters like timber off a ridge," one letter said, "and I will not die letting it happen to the last tender one. Nora is to choose her own man, and I do not care if he is rich or poor, whole or hurt, so long as he is kind to her. For kindness is the only inheritance this family has ever run short of, and the only one worth leaving." We took all of it down the mountain to a lawyer in Hawks Branch, a tired, honest woman named Ada Sturgill, who did wills and water rights and golfed with nobody, and when she read those letters her eyebrows climbed and she said, Mrs. Calhoun, your uncle has made a grave mistake. He's charged you with fraud. But fraud is a thing he has to prove. And the woman who wrote these letters built that will precisely to protect a marriage exactly like yours. I believe we ought to let him try." Something happened in town while we built that case, and it mattered more than I expected. Word travels a holler fast. The same folk who'd found the floor more interesting than my face started coming up my road. A widow I'd made a cradle for once and never charged climbed the track with a basket of eggs and stood on my fixed porch step and said she'd heard the truth of it now and was ashamed she'd believed the easy talk. And would we let her tell the judge that the Ashby story had come to her down a telephone line and not from anybody's honest knowing? Two men who'd helped pull me from under that beam 6 years back offered to sit in the courtroom just so Garrett Ashby would see the cripple Miller he'd counted on having nobody wasn't standing alone. I had spent 6 years certain the town had written me off, and it turned out the town had only been waiting, the way mountain people do, for a reason to come back. Nora watched all of it with a look I couldn't read until she said it out loud one night by the stove. They sent me running to the end of every road I had, she said, hunting a place nobody would stand up for me, and instead I found the one corner of the world that does. I told her that was the thing money never understands. Money can buy a lawyer and a lie and a telephone, but it can't buy a widow who carries eggs up a mountain to swear to the truth for free. The hearing was on the 30th, in the old district courtroom at Hawks Branch. Under a slow ceiling fan and high windows that let the autumn light fall in long bars across the floor. The same building with the floor wax smell where Pruitt had married us. Garrett came in with 3 lawyers and that practiced smile, and he'd brought the smooth, cold-handed man he'd meant Nora to marry, and they sat at their table looking like a bank. We sat at ours with Ada Sturgill and a shoebox of letters, and on the bench behind us were the magistrate, the night clerk, the county inspector, the widow with her eggs, the 2 men who'd pulled me from under the beam, and, when I turned around, half a dozen more from town I hadn't expected. The feed man who never met my eye. The storekeeper. Faces that had been keeping a quieter account of me than I'd known. Garrett's lead lawyer went first, and he was good, smooth and grave, painting a picture of a desperate mountain cripple who'd seen a fortune drive up his road and grabbed it, and a foolish heiress tricked into a marriage cooked up in an afternoon to steal a family's timber. He held up the joint deed. He read my $9,000 banknote into the record like it was a confession, and let the number hang in the air. This man, he said, pointing at me without looking at me, was 19 days from losing everything when he happened to marry an Ashby. The court can draw its own conclusions about the romance involved. I felt my face go hot. Beside me, Nora's hand found mine under the table and held on. Then Ada Sturgill stood up, and she never once raised her voice. She called old Pruitt, who told the court plainly that no one had coached us, that Nora had given her consent freely and clearly, that he'd married 100 couples, and ours was as real as any. She called the county inspector, who read his report on the mill into the record, and the anonymous concern about the works died right there with everyone in the room understanding who had made it and why. And then she did the thing Garrett never saw coming. Because men like Garrett never read the documents they think they own. She entered the grandmother's letters into evidence, and she read them aloud one after another in that quiet courtroom. The old woman's own words about her son selling his daughters like timber, about wanting Nora to choose, rich or poor, whole or hurt, so long as he was kind. And then Ada turned to Garrett, who was no longer smiling, and she said, "Your Honor, the petitioner claims this marriage is a fraud upon the will, but the woman who wrote the will set down in her own hand that she built it to make exactly this marriage possible. The only fraud before this court is the petitioner's, Mr. Garrett Ashby, who has tried to use his mother's own instrument to do the precise thing she designed it to prevent. And we'd note for the record that this is not the first time. We've pulled filings from 2 other counties." And she held up another sheaf of paper, and the soft, sweating lawyer beside Garrett went the color of ash, because Ada had found it, a pattern. 2 earlier cases where Garrett had moved to set aside a relative's inheritance on manufactured grounds, one quietly settled, one dismissed for cause. The courtroom, which had been still, got stiller. The judge was a lean old man named Hargrove who'd said almost nothing all morning, and he took off his glasses and looked at Garrett Ashby a long, long moment. "Mr. Ashby," he said finally, "I've sat on this bench 29 years, and I've learned to tell the difference between a man protecting his family and a man feeding on it. The marriage of Eli and Nora Calhoun is valid in every particular, and is so recognized by this court. The petition to declare it void is denied. The action to quiet title on the timber deed is denied. The transfer was made freely between a husband and wife, and it stands. As for the pattern of filings counsel has brought to my attention, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for review, and I'd advise you to find a different sort of lawyer than the kind you brought today." He set his glasses back on. "That transfer is declared sound. These two are lawfully married. We're adjourned." For a second nobody moved. Then the bench behind me made a low sound. The widow and the 2 men and the feed clerk and the rest. Not a cheer exactly, this isn't a place that cheers, but something. A release of breath, a shifting. The sound of a town quietly changing its mind about a man. Garrett Ashby stood up, and the smile was finally gone, and he had nothing to say. He gathered his lawyers and his cold-handed business partner, and he walked out of that courtroom into the white light, and the room turned its back on him as he went, and he was, I'd guess for the first time in his life, a poor man in every way that counts. Outside on the courthouse steps, Nora stood blinking in the sun with the shoebox of her grandmother's letters in her arms, and the feed man came up, the one who'd never met my eye, and he stuck out his hand and said, "Eli, your daddy'd be proud of how you stood up in there. We should have come around sooner." And I shook his hand, and I said the only thing I had, which was, anybody would have stood up. She's worth standing up for. But the mill note was still due that day, and even winning a courtroom doesn't make $9,000 appear in a coffee tin. We drove down to the bank ready to beg 2 more weeks, and we found out that the will, Nora's now free and clear on her 28th birthday, recognized by the court not 3 hours old, had settled into an account that very morning. She could have paid the note 10 times over and bought herself a far easier life than a leaning mill at the bottom of a holler. She stood in the bank with the papers in her hand and looked at me, and I made myself say it, because a man has to give a person the door even when he's praying she won't take it. "You're free now, Nora," I said. "Truly free. The will is yours, the family's beaten, and you owe me nothing. I meant my vow, but I won't hold you to a marriage you made to a stranger to save your skin. If you want to take your money and your life and go, I'll sign whatever you set before me, and I'll think well of you every day of mine." She was quiet a moment. Then she set the bank papers on the counter, and she took my scarred hand in both of hers, right there in front of God and the teller and the whole of Hawks Branch, and she said, "Eli Calhoun, I drove to the end of every road I had hunting a way out, and I found the only road I ever want to be on. I'm not free of you. I don't want to be. Pay the note. It's our mill." And then she paid it herself and laughed at me when I tried to argue, and we drove home up the holler in the gold evening light. Married twice over now, once on paper to save her and once for real. Somewhere between a crooked hinge and a jar of creek asters and a courtroom full of a dead woman's letters who'd understood, before either of us did. That kindness was the only fortune worth leaving behind. A year after the night she came up my road, The mill was a different place, and so was I. The will didn't make us idle, it made us able. We squared the leaning loft that had taken my leg, and this time it went up strong and true, and the wheel turned smooth all winter, and Nora set my chairs and cradles before the right buyers at the right price, and the work that had barely fed me began to keep us well. The town came up our road now, without being asked. Mountain folk brought their corn again, and the widow's grandchildren learned to fish the mill pond, and Ada Sturgill came to Sunday dinner most weeks and argued politics with whoever showed. Garrett Ashby, I heard, had his troubles with the district attorney and lost a good deal of what he'd spent his life clutching, and I won't say I was sorry, but I found I didn't think on him much, which is its own kind of winning. Nora took the timber rights her grandmother left her and did the thing that told me all over again who I'd married. She put the 3 ridges into a trust that can never be cut clear, only tended, so the mountain her grandmother loved would stand for her children's children. And on the porch where I light the lantern every night out of stubbornness, there's a second chair now, and lately a small cradle I carved out of the same chestnut as the mill. Because on an evening in October, almost exactly a year on, with the light going amber and then deep blue down the holler the way it had that first night, Nora took my hand and pressed it flat against herself just below her ribs and said, low and steady the way she says the things that turn a whole life over, "We're going to have a baby, Eli. They sent a stranger up my road to be sold, and I had asked her only what she was running from. And from that one question I had been given everything. I think on Garrett Ashby sometimes, not with anger anymore, only with a kind of wonder at how wrong a man can be about where the cruelty lands. He looked at my cane and my debt and my leaning mill and decided this was the worst place on earth. A punishment. A thing to throw a woman into. He was so sure that what makes a life small is the size of the building and the money in the bank and the soundness of a man's legs. He never once considered that the only thing that had ever made my life small was that no one had stopped to ask my name, and the only thing that had ever made Nora's small was that no one had ever let her answer. We asked each other. That was all. That was everything. So if you take one thing from a miller at the bottom of a holler, take this. The people who think kindness is weakness, and a scar is a verdict, and a quiet life is a small one, are the ones who lose in the end, every time. They sent her up my road to break her. And a frightened thing, sheltered by the right hands, doesn't stay frightened. It just learns, at last, that it was never the problem at all. Only a person who'd never once been asked what she was running from, standing at the end of a dark road in a thin coat, waiting for somebody poor enough to have nothing left to give her but the one thing that mattered.